Hello and welcome back to Sibos TV. I'm Jack DeLosa.
And I'm Juliet Foster. Coming up here on Sibos today, we'll be looking at how financial technology is speeding up transactions in trade finance.
We'll also be asking how the smaller firms can protect themselves from cybercrime and other fraud without the same access to big resources. That's all to come in the next half hour here on Sibos TV. The problems and inefficiencies within trade finance are well documented.
And now banks are beginning to embrace the benefits and the solutions of blockchain and other financial technologies to speed up transactions. Well, Finbarr Bermingham is the Asia editor of Global Trade Review. Welcome to Sibos TV. Thanks for joining us. And look, tell us about the progress that's being made in this area.
Yeah, it's made real strides over the last, well, certainly in 2018. Think about 2016 and 17, all of the banks were doing proof of concepts and pilots, trying to show that perhaps there was a use for blockchain technology in trade finance. It was very frustrating as a journalist because they would do these pilots, they would do these proofs of concepts, and then they would be parked and they wouldn't go any further. 2018, we've seen a lot more sort of progress with live transactions being done on blockchain, with numerous consortia involving some of the big banks in the world, some of the big shipping companies, all sort of moving towards a commercial blockchain solution for the trade finance industry. So slowly, but it's getting there.
But Finbarr, in your view, why has it taken so long?
I mean, you've got an ancient industry. I mean, the trade finance industry is basically paper-based. Everything is done manually. Everything is done by hand, by courier. So in many instances, you've got cargoes of oil, cargoes of commodities, which are arriving in their destination before the documents which underlie them. So basically, it's an industry which is very much set in its ways. So there's a lot of vested interest. There's a lot of people who have been in the industry for decades and decades. The bank systems are all entirely legacy. Some of them I've heard use pre-Microsoft systems in the banks. They use green screen. So to then go from that to make the leap to blockchain technology is quite, it's quite a big thing to do. So, I mean, I think it's natural that it's taking a long time. I think that eventually it will be more of the next 5 or 10 years rather than an instant thing that we'll see. But yeah, it's because it's such a massive leap. You're basically taking from something that's been used since ancient Rome, the letter of credit and documentary credit, and trying to replace it with something, that most people can't even get their heads around. The technology that's used to trade Bitcoin. So it's a great leap.
But is that the only thing that's holding it up, or are there other factors involved as well?
Well, I mean, it's a huge cost. There's huge risks involved, I suppose. It's just like changing anything. I mean, you really have to have everybody onboarded. This is not the sort of thing that one bank can even make a dent in. It would have to be an industry-wide effort. Banks inherently don't like collaborating. They're sort of competitors. They have a lot of proprietary information. They don't want to lose clients to other banks, so it's not really in their nature to collaborate with one another. And yet, if you really want to implement a blockchain solution in the trade finance industry, it has to have the buy-in of everybody. So that's another reason why it hasn't really taken off as yet.
And Finbarr, why are people wanting to use it? What is the benefit?
Well, if you think about the fact that trade finance is basically done using pieces of paper, that leaves so much room for fraud. It's very easy to manipulate an invoice that's written by hand. It's very easy to forge a warehouse receipt, and that's something we see all the time. We see cases in Asia and elsewhere of, bad actors, to use a term that's in the industry, basically using a fraudulent warehouse receipt to get a loan from a bank, and then maybe using that same receipt to get a loan from 10 other banks. So the banks are getting hit in the pocket here with fraud. So if they digitize the whole process, then the argument is then it would be less vulnerable to fraud. That's one aspect. Also the fact that it's an incredibly inefficient industry. As I alluded to, there's paper-based processes that take weeks to get from A to B. They're all done using courier, so it's costly as well. So I mean, those are the incentives for I guess bringing it into the digital era.
But what are the implications? We see the benefits of the digital. The use of that digital technology, but as you're saying, some areas, well, some institutions haven't quite got there yet. So for the ones which are trying to find their way, what are the implications for them?
Do you mean like the negative implications, perhaps of blockchain technology for the banking industry? I mean, there is the argument that if banks don't embrace this technology, they could be basically left redundant. If not redundant, then certainly lose a lot of the auxiliary services that they offer. This is a way of sort of democratizing this financial services industry by decentralizing it away from the sort of very primacy of banks, which, if they don't sort of move with the times and with the digital era, we may just become a lender of note. They won't be able to offer all the additional services that they already do, because there'll be smaller and more nimble and more efficient fintech companies that potentially could do that. Thinking about things like payment processing, or any sort of warehouse management or so on. If a bank's still living in the Stone Age and it's not moving with the times, then they could be disintermediated. So that's one of the challenges that banks face when dealing with blockchain. And possibly that's one of the reasons why they are so vocally trying to embrace it as well.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting point. What other areas of fintech are making waves in trade finance?
It's an industry that's ripe for disruption, but then again, they've been saying that for decades. But it feels like with the latest and the current wave of fintech developments, there really are some exciting technologies. Artificial intelligence. I mean, there's a massive trade finance gap, particularly in Asia Pacific, where banks are, the banks have basically been told that they have to know your customer, they have to know everything when they're onboarding their customer, and this is making them not really want to finance business in perceived risky markets. So maybe somewhere in emerging Asia, for example, they may not go to the nth degree in order to find out who this trader is, because they don't want to incur the cost of that. Things such as artificial technology and machine learning can help to automate that process. They can, big data can also allow banks to leverage technology such as those to make that a bit of a smoother process. And hopefully with a bit of luck, it will mean that there's it helps fund trade in developing markets.
Okay, so much to think about and pursue. But Finbarr Bermingham, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on Sibos TV. Thank you.
Quantum computing was first theorized in the 1980s. Scientists speculated that a huge leap in the power of computing could be achieved if we harnessed the physics of subatomic particles. For a long time, it seemed like science fiction, but in the last year or two, quantum computing has been getting a great deal of serious attention across the banking industry. Here to tell us why, we're joined by Dr. Anna Fan, research scientist at IBM, and Dr. Leda Glyptis, Chief of Staff at 11FS. Anna and Leda, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Anna, we might start with you. Talk to us about why quantum computing is getting so much attention in the banking industry right now.
So quantum computing is actually getting a lot of attention from all types of industries at the moment, because we've had a huge improvement in the technology over the past couple of years. So we're at a very interesting stage with the hardware at the moment, where we're really at the limits of what we can do with our classical computers today compared to our quantum computers. So in the next few years, we think that we'll actually be able to find a use case where a quantum computer, we're able to solve it faster than a classical computer.
Does this mean that quantum computers will ultimately replace ordinary computers?
No, so we see them working in tandem with classical computers, similarly to how cars work in tandem with planes. You use a classical computer for, let's say, emails or slides, and you'll use a quantum computer for specialized applications.
And I know we're all fascinated by this. What capabilities do quantum computers have that traditional computers don't?
So that's actually something that research scientists and industry experts are working on today.
Right.
So we know that in the future, when we have very, very large quantum computers, they'll be able to solve some very specific problems. But now that we have the hardware and we can play with it, we're seeing other applications emerge. Things like improving Monte Carlo simulations, things like trying to see if we can do quantum machine learning, things like if we're trying to improve optimization.
Right. And are there any other applications that you see quantum computing making, either to the banking world or the world at large?
So we've been playing with, there's some people have been theorizing some interesting work in these Monte Carlo simulations for risk analysis and derivatives pricing. They've been able to show a bit of a speed up maybe compared to classical computers, but currently we only have very small quantum computers and we have very, very large classical computers. So it's a bit of an unfair analogy, like unfair comparison.
Right. And Leda, if we go to you, how do you think quantum computing will benefit the banking industry specifically?
There are two areas where bankers are beginning to sort of wake up to quantum computing. One is the speed question, and from a banker's perspective, there's a little bit of a, I don't need to worry about that too much yet because it's not ready, and also technology is faster than most of banking processing anyway, so I can let that develop. But the second area that is both extremely exciting and a little scary from a banking perspective is what Anna touched on. What else could it do in terms of stimulation, risk analysis, and pricing? And it's an open and unanswered question for banks, but I expect that we will have a lot of bankers flocking to Anna's session and other sessions like it to learn what it is they need to be thinking about.
Yeah, it definitely wouldn't surprise me. Leda, what do banking professionals need to know about quantum computing in order to really harness its power?
So there are three things that bankers need to sort of be thinking about. One is they don't fully understand how their systems work today unless they're in IT. And that's okay. So they don't need to first understand how quantum computing works in order to use it. And that sounds so basic, but actually there is a need, and we've seen it with the digital transformation work that we've been doing over the last few years. There's this need to understand how things work from people who didn't necessarily have the right background in physics or computing. So letting go of that need and focusing on the capabilities and the art of the possible is a big thing. The second is, in order to understand how this works, there needs to be an understanding that as a bank, you probably won't own the hardware. So it's about the types of partnerships you're comfortable building with people who will invest in the hardware, who will have the hardware and can help you think it through. And then the third piece is the imagination component. If this technology allows you to think about pricing differently, risk differently, then that differently piece is half about the technology and half about the business knowledge. Hiring people who can bridge that gap is the next big challenge for the industry.
Let's talk about that. What sort of people do you believe we need to be bringing into the industry?
We're already seeing a shift from a division between our technologists and our business people to hybrid teams and hybrid capabilities and people who combine the two in order to take banks from an analog world into a sort of more digital world. That will be an absolute necessity as you're going forward. I remember many years ago I had to go through all the hoops manageable to hire a theoretical physicist in a technology team because nobody could understand the value they would bring at the time. Now we will be going out hunting for them because they are the people who can help us bridge those gaps. But the answer truly is we don't know. Right? As these capabilities emerge, we will start seeing the knowledge gaps and skills gaps we have in banking in the next 2 to 5 years, and we'll be hiring a very different type of person.
Yes. Anna, let's further explore the when. When do you think that quantum computing will be widely used across the banking industry?
So I think in the near term, let's say the 2 to 5 year stage, we'll find that application where quantum computers will be able to do something of use compared to classical computers. So that will be companies and industries will be using them for those particular applications. And I think in terms of broader adoption and use by multiple applications and use cases, that will be sort of decades in the future.
Dr. Anna Fan, Dr. Leda Glyptis, thank you so much for joining us on Sibos TV.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Large, mature organisations have fairly comprehensive cyber and fraud prevention plans in place to protect themselves.
But how can small regional firms protect themselves without access to the same big resources, budgets or deep skills?
Well, to help us suggest some answers, we're joined in the studio by Francisco Hartmann, who is Head of Division at the European Central Bank, the ECB, Andrew Pade, who's Chief Information Security Officer at the Reserve Bank of Australia, and Rob Sloan, who's the Cybersecurity Research Director for the Wall Street Journal. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. And Andrew, I'd like to start first with you. Would you say that smaller organisations are at risk of being targeted by cyber criminals, or are larger organisations the more likeable target because they've got more cash?
Well, generally what you'll find is that the cyber criminals will will be attempting to get into any organisation, and they'll take the opportunity at any organisation. What you'll find is that some of the complexities around larger organisations give cyber criminals an opportunity to a larger surface area for them to get in, whereas smaller organisations often lack some of the deeper knowledge in the cybersecurity space to better secure their environment. So there's some of the challenges that both have, but they're facing the same kind of attacks.
Let's dive into some of the vulnerabilities of the smaller organisations relative to the larger organisations. What do you think some of the vulnerability points are?
Well, what you've seen in the last few years is quite a change in cybersecurity. Security initially started as a single team, often managing out of a mainframe environment, has grown into sort of 5 or 6 different domains of security where there's deep knowledge. You've got pen testing, and then you've got security policies, and you've got security architecture. So it's quite deep knowledge that have been developed in larger organisations, whereas your smaller organisation might have only a handful of people and sort of lack that depth across those domains of security and really rely on external vendors or support to provide that information to backfill. So there you have some challenges where those smaller organisations haven't fully integrated some of those more deeper knowledge or deeper areas in security and applied them to their organisation. There's some gaps there.
And Rob, what would you say are the challenges that smaller organisations face when it comes to developing their cybersecurity?
So I think I'd highlight a few things. I think the first thing any small organisation, regardless of industry, needs to do is get the support of their senior leadership team and their board, explain to them in plain English, in business risk terms, what cybersecurity is, what it means to their business. Without their buy-in, really your cybersecurity strategy is not going to work. Once you have their support, you look at the resources you have access to work out what you're going to be able to do, and then prioritise the things that need doing. And there really is no one-size-fits-all approach to how you go about developing your cybersecurity strategy. It really is a question of what you've got to work with, the resources you've got, the budget you've got, and how bad things already are for you.
But Rob, counterintuitively, are there any advantages that smaller businesses have that larger businesses don't?
So I think smaller organisations typically have a lot of disadvantages. When we think they typically have fewer skilled personnel on staff, they have less access to third-party consultancy expertise, smaller budgets, the technology solutions don't always scale down for them. One significant advantage they do have is that they don't have all of the legacy infrastructure, the mainframes, the servers, the data centers that some of the larger organizations are dealing with. That allows them to be more flexible, more nimble, to exploit the cloud, and really reduce the amount of IT they have to own and operate, concentrate on their core mission.
Okay, so let's take that point and develop it a little bit further, Francisco, because yes, there are disadvantages, but at the same time, as Rob pointed out, at least some of the smaller organisations are not saddled with legacy issues. So how should they go about approaching their cybersecurity? Is there a specific framework or methodology that they can use just to set the ball rolling?
I don't like to distinguish between small and large organizations because at the end is the ecosystem, and the ecosystem is having both. So in this context, I think that what is important is that all organizations are prepared for cybersecurity, to address cybersecurity. What is for me, when you were asking me about a framework, I can tell you the experience we have in Europe. We developed something, for example, we call Cyber.eu, which is about organizing penetration testing. So it's a framework that is harmonized in Europe, which is good because I think that at the end makes all organizations at the same level of security. And we believe that is very important for Europe. But when we are talking about cyber, we are talking about an interconnected world, not only in Europe, also Australia, US, Asia. So I think that this kind of frameworks should be applicable also to the whole community, to the whole financial infrastructure. Absolutely.
And Andrew, can you give us some concrete examples of initiatives that long-tail organisations have taken to get on top of their cybersecurity?
Mm-hmm. The smaller firms have really been quick to move into the cloud. They realise they don't have the cybersecurity expertise in-house, and they know that if they move into a cloud, the cloud provider has already met particular security standards, and it's already built in. And so they'll just have to move into that environment. And because they don't have the complexities, and as Rob was saying, some of the legacy equipment, they can move to the cloud quickly and take that benefit. So they've been really doing that very quickly. And what you'll find is that the larger organisations are a bit slower to move into that space purely because of the complexity.
Yep.
And Francisco, why is it important to have this coordination and cooperation in the ecosystem of financial services and beyond? We've been talking about the importance as such, but really give it a sense of context. Just why?
Yeah. The context is very important. Again, we are talking about interconnected institutions. So when you have interconnected institutions, at the end, again, the weakest link is making the ecosystem not secure enough. So at the end, we have to address all institutions. And in this sense, cooperation and coordination is very important. It's very important that all organizations, small and large, are cooperating, are coordinating, are sharing experiences, and this is very important. Again, and I want to talk about the European example. The European Central Bank established what we call the European Cyber Resilience Board. What is this? What is this kind of board? It's a board of high-level representatives of the banking sector, of the market infrastructure sector, of the authorities, where they share information about cyber-related events. So at the end, all of us learn from the experiences from others. So again, I think that what is important is that security should not be seen as a competitive issue, it should be a collaboration issue.
Francisco, as a regulator, what do you see your role as being in ensuring that businesses, as you say, small and large, are taking cybersecurity seriously?
Create awareness. You have to create awareness to the financial industry. When I mentioned before the European Cyber Resilience Board, you create awareness about the board at board level of the different institutions about the importance of cybersecurity. And then also you have to create, based on this exchange of views, you have to create a framework by which you test your systems. You are sure that you have a safe infrastructure. And in this respect also, I mentioned before the Cyber EU experience in Europe is a good framework to make sure that the infrastructures are safe enough. Also very important that you have an harmonized framework, and in this respect is very important for global banks. Yesterday in the panel, where we were in the panel, a representative of JP Morgan was saying how important it is to have an harmonized framework for conducting these kind of activities.
Okay, and Rob, I guess the challenge as well for many organizations is really focusing on the right things to prevent, detect and recover. I mean, how can they be sure? Because there are so many different threats coming from cyber attacks, and it's often scattergun. It could be one part of an organization that seems attractive as opposed to somewhere else. So, how can they determine what is the right point of focus?
It's quite difficult. Protection, prevention, detection and response, it's like having 3 children. You can't choose between them. You need to give them equal love and make sure that they're nurtured and taken care of. You have to be doing all things at all times, of course. The prevention, protection part is critical. That's going to mean that the majority of lower-level threats don't get through. But you also have to accept that some of the higher-level threats will get through. You're going to have to get them identified and responded to as soon as possible, because that's really going to limit the amount of damage that an attacker is able to do.
Rob, I hope I'm not asking you about your favourite child, but if you were to give small businesses one piece of advice about how they can get on top of this sort of stuff, what would that be?
Just one?
Just one.
Just
You've
one.
got to pick one.
Okay. So there is a window of vulnerability that all organizations have, and it begins when a software vendor issues a security patch, and the window closes when the organization installs it and protects all of their endpoints. That window of vulnerability is the window of opportunities for an attacker to get in.
Right.
So if you have really robust security patching processes, you're going to reduce the likelihood that an attacker is able to exploit you on something where there is a protection there for you to install. You shouldn't need to get affected by this threat. So robust patching processes.
Okay, good piece of advice on which to end. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on Sibos TV. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for this show, but there's more to come here on Sibos TV, including live coverage of the main conference session on disrupting financial crime by forging public-private partnerships between law enforcement and financial institutions.
Thank you for watching, and we will be back soon talking over more of the key issues here at Sibos 2018.